One of the biggest scandals of the Trump administration has certainly been family separation. Now, many people watching this video are probably aware that the policy of family separation did not begin under President Trump, but you might not be aware of just how long that sort of policy and variations on it have been a part of American governance. And joining us now to break this down, author of the new book, Taking Children, A History of American Terror, we have the professor of women, gender, and sexuality studies at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, Laura Briggs. Welcome to the Damage Report.
Thanks for having me on, John.
Very glad to have you on. Incredibly important topic. Can you tell us a little bit about the genesis of this book?
Sure. Well, the book started because the Attorney General's office in the state of Washington asked me to talk about whether there had ever been in the history of the United States a policy of separating children from their parents for political ends. And I was like, yeah, I've been writing about that for years. We've been doing it since slavery times in the United States. And so I started working on this book. It started out as part of a brief to stop the Trump administration's policy in 2018.
Okay. And I know that the blurb of the book has a particularly chilling quote from Donald Trump. The quote is, "You have to take the children away." Now, of course, this book encompasses so much more than just the Trump administration. But just for a second, what do you think about the most recent few years of family separation? Is it different in any significant fashion from some of the other forms this sort of policy has taken?
Sure. Well, so Trump was fond of saying that the Obama administration took children from their parents, which isn't actually true. However, we heard a lot under the Trump administration about the Flores Agreement, right? And that was supposed to guarantee that children were going to be treated humanely and decently in immigration detention. Well, the Flores Agreement had its genesis in the Reagan administration. The Reagan administration was the first to use putting children in immigration detention as a strategy to try to get people from trying to escape from political conditions that the U.S. had a role in creating in Central America. So in recent years, since 2019, so in 2018, we all knew about this policy. Lots of people went to demonstrations, opposed it, and so on. And a judge ordered the Trump administration to stop. But what the Stephen Miller wing of the Trump administration quickly understood is what previous presidents had long figured out, which is putting crying children in front of reporters and activists doesn't work out well. But if you say that their parents are criminals or neglectful, you can continue a policy that's supposed to be a deterrent to people who want to apply for asylum and refugee status in the United States by taking their children, and nobody will object as long as you say that they're criminals or neglecting their children.
Yeah, and you've already mentioned several different ways, stretching back literally hundreds of years, the pretexts that have been used for this sort of family separation. I'm sure you can expand on many of them, the race-based and class-based and all of that. And they do seem to always be presented in some form like what you just said, that this is not about separation or ruining a family or intimidating. This is about protecting the children. And I think that most Americans probably are primed to think of family separations in one form or another through that lens. Do you think that is sort of a fundamentally incorrect way to look at it? How else might it be framed, these sorts of policies?
Well, since the earliest days of the Republic, we've framed our intervention, our land grabs, our settler colonialism always as in humanitarian interests, right? So U.S. empire is always in the best interests of Native people who are losing their land, and that's one of the first times that the U.S. used a policy of separating children. That Native kids didn't learn English, didn't have an opportunity to go to school, and so they were going to take children as as very explicitly a strategy to end the Indian Wars in the 1880s and 1890s, and put them in boarding schools. And we know how that turned out. In 1929, the Merriam Report found that they were dying of disease in horrible numbers, that they were underfed, that most of them were illiterate. But we've always, whether it was the crack baby epidemic or saving impoverished kids from their bad, immoral welfare mothers, we've always taken children with the idea that it was in the children's best interest.
As you look back over the history of these sorts of policies and how they've evolved over time, and even just recently, the backlash to this policy that you saw, is there reason to believe that we might see less of this at some point? Are we seeing less? Is it becoming a little bit more difficult for the government to sell these sorts of interventions as necessary? Is there reason to be a little bit hopeful about the future that we might see an end to this sort of barbarism?
Well, unfortunately, the Trump administration actually accomplished its goal, which was effectively dismantling the asylum system, which is supported by U.S. and international law under cover of the COVID crisis. So since March 20th of this year, the Trump administration has been picking up anybody who sought to come to the United States and apply for refugee status and pushing them back across the border to Mexico or deporting them to El Salvador or Honduras and saying, you just can't come here because it's too dangerous. Initially, they said the U.S. was full, and then they said, we're just not going to let you in, and now it's nobody's going to be allowed to cross the border because we have a COVID crisis.
I just want to briefly note for the audience, it is interesting that they apparently acknowledge that the crisis continues, at least in this very minor area, if not in others.
That's right. Nurses can't get PPE. Nobody can get a COVID test. But if you want to get refugee or asylum status, there's a crisis.
Suddenly there's a pandemic.
For more political news, breakdowns, interviews, stories of activism, and me trying my hardest to care about the occasional big celebrity news story, subscribe to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/The Damage Report. And you can ring the bell wherever it is so you don't miss anything.